There are people who travel the world searching for extraordinary stories. And then there are people like George Weber who spend a lifetime discovering that the extraordinary has been quietly waiting at home in the lives of small-town characters and the theater of big prairie skies. For more than 50 years, George has photographed the people, towns, landscapes, and communities of Alberta and Saskatchewan with remarkable tenderness. His photographs have become one of the great visual archives of the Canadian Prairies because he spent a lifetime witnessing the light in ordinary places and in ordinary lives. In this conversation, we explore photography as an act of remembrance, the power of story, the changing face of Alberta, and why the passage of time transforms simple photographs into priceless records of who we were. Hey everyone, I'm Yamuna. Welcome to the first season of The Long Road Home, a podcast where travelers, storytellers, and culture makers I've met along my global journeys share the stories behind their paths, their roots, the roads they've traveled, and how those journeys have helped them find their way home in the world and within themselves. I'm so glad to have you here with me. Let's go! Hi, everyone. Today, I'm honored to welcome documentary photographer George Weber to the show. For 50 years, George has devoted his life to photographing the people, landscapes, small towns, and quiet corners of the Canadian Prairies. His work isn't simply about documenting Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's about preserving the stories of the people who have shaped these places and the communities that continue to give them life. He is the author of numerous acclaimed photography books, including Borrowed Time, Alberta Book, Saskatchewan Book, Prairie Gothic, Badlands, People of the Blood, Last Call, A World Within, In This Place, and Requiem. His photographs are held in museum collections across Canada and around the world, including Library and Archives Canada, the Glenbow Museum, the Art Gallery of Alberta, the Australian National Gallery, Museum Ludwig in Germany, and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. George is a member of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts and a two-time National Magazine Gold Award winner for photojournalism. But beyond the accolades, what continues to draw me to his work is the tenderness with which he photographs ordinary lives. His images remind us that every face, every prairie town, every weathered building carries a story worth remembering. Thank you so much for being here, George. This is such an honor to have you on the show.
It's just great to welcome you back to the darkroom here, Yamuna. And as you recall, this is where we first met almost 20 years ago.
Almost 20 years ago. It's incredible. So for folks listening out there, we are in the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, the dark room, which is a place where we met, I think in 2008 or 2009, so we're getting to almost 20 years. And I took your basics darkroom course here, which then inspired me and led me to set up my own darkroom in India some time later. And ever since then, we've been friends, and you've been a great inspiration to me in my own practice. And I'm just so thrilled to have you here speaking about your work. I want to ground the listeners a little bit in who you are and where you come from. So could you tell us a little bit about where you were born and what led you to the photography work that you've done?
Yeah, well, I was born in southern Alberta nearly 75 years ago in a small mining town, a place called Drumheller, Alberta, that was known primarily for two things. One was it was an important part of the coal mining industry in Western Canada. And secondarily, the Drumheller Badlands are one of the richest sources of dinosaur bone and fossil remains anywhere in the world. And as a boy growing up in that town, I was fascinated and would go with my grandfather, Frank. We would hunt for dinosaur bones. It was kind of like a perfect childhood. I was also blessed to see First Nations people, Hutterite people, farmers. Just the amazingly diverse face of small town Alberta in the 1950s. And then our family moved to Calgary when I was about 6. And then about 20 years later, I picked up a camera for the first time. And in a sense, you might say that everything I've done in these past 50 years is me in an aging body, but a 6-year-old's brain reconnecting to these incredibly wonderful places and connecting with these amazing people that are part of the culture of this part of the world.
That's so beautiful. And I remember one of the things that really struck me when I first discovered your work as your student was that you have developed your, entire career and legacy around a part of the world that I've spent a lot of time trying to escape from. And so even though I was born in Alberta as well, just seeing the stories and the tenderness with which you've approached these subjects and places that I kind of saw as boring when I grew up here. And I wanted the exotic adventures. And so your work is incredibly inspiring. And we do have a number of books open in front of us. And there's a couple of stories that I'm really excited to hear about. But I'm wondering, when you look back over this career of, 5 decades photographing this part of the world, what is the thing about Alberta that you feel like has, or the prairies perhaps, has really held your attention all of these years?
Well, it's an incredible place to make photographs. It's a very theatrical place in that when you're out photographing in a small town or on a First Nations reserve or in a Hutterite colony, in the prairies, there's lots of space, there's lots of sky. The human endeavor, the little vertical human presence on that incredibly dramatic, large horizontal landscape is incredibly aesthetically arresting for me. I think also there is just the sense, and I think this does also relate to my boyhood, that when I was up hunting for the dinosaur bones with my grandfather, the idea that the past and the stories of the past are even more interesting than the present or the future, that came to me. I think possibly also my Catholic upbringing. I remember as a young boy leaning into my dad at St. Anthony's Church in Drumheller and looking up at the stained glass windows, listening to the priest droning on and nodding off. But part of the Catholic tradition is the idea that moral values, life lessons, inspiration is very frequently in the Catholic tradition attached to narrative or to story. Story as a vehicle, for want of a better word, for conveying important information. And I think even since my childhood, I've had an insatiable appetite for story, because I think you do learn from story. You're always given the opportunity to be inspired, you're invited into a level of compassion. You're invited into a level of honoring the challenges of people's lives. And, for me, story it's like oxygen, and I have an insatiable appetite for it because it is so useful. It lets me get through my own life. And that draws me. I was downtown last night. I met a couple of guys living in the East Village, which is sort of a down and out part of Calgary, right? And we spent about an hour together, them telling me about their stories of coming from northern Alberta, one from Calgary, one from the Maritimes. And I think my authentic, respectful, honest appetite comes across. And that opens people up in an amazing way. And there's that gift of intimacy that I've been given so many times in my life, because people take my measure and they feel authentically respected, valued, and I hope safe in my presence.
I can see that in the photographs. And what I find particularly remarkable about your photographs is, like, there's this element of, Well, in all photographs, in a sense, in this kind of documentary work, I sort of think of portraiture. It's almost like self-portraiture. Like I can see you in your photographs because of how your subjects are responding to you as a person. And there is this safety and this tenderness and this intimacy that you are granted, which is so remarkable. And I would love if we could actually share one of the stories. Perhaps one of my favorite stories is Mr. and Mrs. Chu, who I see in this book here. Can you tell us the title of this book where this photograph features?
So the book that you're looking at and referring to right now, Yamuna, is a book called Prairie Gothic. And, it's not only one of your favorite photographs, but more importantly, it's one of my mom's all-time favorite photographs.
That's
right?
important. Yeah.
And especially because of the story behind it. So I'd done approximately a 2-week trip. I left my home in Calgary. I traveled down into the northern United States, and had spent a lot of time in North Dakota and Wyoming photographing. I came back across the Canadian border, not far from the city of Lethbridge, which is a relatively large city in southern Alberta. As I was approaching Lethbridge, I glanced off to my left and I saw a sign for a little place called New Dayton, Alberta. And I was running a little tight for time, but I thought, I hadn't been there. Maybe I'm going to stop in there and have a look. So I pulled up to the front of this piece of sort of classic prairie architecture, what's sometimes referred to as the false front, a large facade fronting a very modest building. And it said ND Cafe. So I stopped, I walked in, and it was a little combination of a very tiny restaurant and a general store. I met a man there, an elderly man, and he told me that his name was Charlie Chu. And so we chatted for a while, and I was so taken by him and his story, his dignity, his tiny, soft demeanor, and the incredible place that he was in. If you look at the photograph, you'll see it harkens back to an earlier time in retail. There's a counter, and everything is behind the counter on tall shelves. So that if someone went into the store, they would tell him what they wanted. He would pull it down, a box of potato chips, a box of tobacco, and hand it across to them. So it really is, it's kind of iconic in terms of small business, the prairie. It speaks about, the immigrant experience. It speaks about the nature of marketing food and selling at that particular time. So I asked him, because I was so taken with him and the environment, if I could do some photographs, and he said yes. And I did the photographs. Just as I was leaving, he said, "Can you wait for just a minute?" I said, "Of course." He went into the back. He came out holding the hand of this diminutive woman, his wife. And he'd also, as you can see in the photograph, he put a tie on before he came out for this photograph. And the two of them stood in front of the counter. And I attempted to explain that because we were photographing inside, they had to be still so that the photograph would be sharp. And I spoke with him. And then every time I spoke to him, he turned to her and whispered. And at that moment, I wasn't completely clear in terms of what was happening. But as I found out subsequently, she spoke virtually no English. So we did the photographs, and I got one on the roll of 12 exposures that was perfect and everything was sharp and clear. At the end of the session, he said, "Would you send me a photograph?" And of course, I said I would. So I was writing down his mailing address information. And then just in order to seal a contract, he slipped a package of Wrigley spearmint gum across the countertop so that we then had a legally binding contract.
Absolutely.
Of course, right? And then, so I mailed the photograph, and then I didn't have the opportunity to go down and visit for a period of time. So when I was next there, I drove down the street. I saw the store, but it was completely barricaded up. And so I wondered what had happened. So there was one other store in the town. I spoke to the person who was running it, and he explained that Mr. and Mrs. Chu had both passed away. And I was curious about their lives before and what had happened. And the man that I was speaking to, he directed me to the nearby city of Lethbridge, and I went there and I met the grandson. And Mr. and Mrs. Chu's grandson then told me what is one of the most remarkable and inspiring stories that I've ever heard. The couple were married in 1930. They had they had a single child, and then in 1931 they decided that Mr. Chu would come to Canada and work with his father in the store in New Dayton. And when the economics were viable, he would bring his wife, his child, and the second child that she was carrying. When he left, she was midway through a pregnancy. They had an embrace. 1931. He sees his young daughter, a toddler, and he touches through his tummy the second child. Because of economic circumstances, finances, some slightly exclusionary Canadian laws of the time, Mr. and Mrs. Chu were not reunited in Canada until 1986. They didn't lay eyes on each other, this husband and wife, for 55 years. When I heard that story, I started to do some additional research. And the local newspaper, around the time that Mrs. Chu arrived, interviewed Charlie, and he said with great understatement, it was the greatest day of my life, essentially, right? When I went into this store later, there were some other very poignant things, because I had a very powerful sense. Where the little business is located is right on the edge of the prairie, and when you look east, you can look literally for hundreds and hundreds of miles, seeing nothing but the prairie landscape as it unfolds, taking you to Saskatchewan. And I felt her presence when I was standing in that room. I felt it powerfully when I was standing there looking out that window. I felt the presence of this woman who had come from so far away to essentially be reconnected with her husband, but with a stranger. She didn't speak any English at the time, right? And, it was a powerful thing. The other thing that I discovered in the store that I found so heartbreaking and kind of beautiful, Mr. Chu, of course, lived without his family all of those years, right? And in the store, there was a little cigar box. And so I opened the cigar box, and the cigar box was stuffed with school pictures of the kids that had gone to the school down the road from where the store was, right? And those kids had come in over decades, brought Charlie a photograph. He would have, given them a coat, whatever. And so he did have that connection with family and child. And the last thing that I should mention, which I should have mentioned earlier, when Mrs. Chu came to Canada, she, of course, as an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, not speaking English, needed some help to come to Canada. So the person that accompanied her was her grandson. And that grandson's father was the baby boy that Charlie only ever saw in his wife's belly.
Wow. That is an incredible story that I think many people would never have known had you not taken that photograph. So there is this incredible, archival legacy that you are creating with your work in these very mundane moments, right? In these places that are hardly visited by anybody, and that you could perhaps pass through and not really see anything of interest. And instead you've unearthed this entire life story that would have gone, to the grave probably. So as a documentary photographer and as a kind of archivist of these stories of Southern Alberta and beyond, how do you deal with the responsibility of telling stories and these kinds of relationships that you're creating?
Well, the French have an incredibly beautiful quote. that I often think about when I'm out photographing. And they say, quote, "The eyes are the scouts of the heart,"
Oh, that's
right?
beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful?
Hmm.
And there is something about that affection and yearning for narrative, yearning for story that really, kind of sets me up. And I'm going to mention another incredible quote. William Faulkner, as you know, his great legacy, his great and magisterial and important contribution to American letters was really kind of set in his neighborhood. And Faulkner once said, "I discovered that my own little postage stamp of native soil was worth writing about, and that I would never live long enough to exhaust it." And I think that, uh, not comparing myself to William Faulkner, obviously, but that motivational thing about seeing really deeply and affectionately uh, your part of the world it's a blessing. It's not an intentional thing. It's just the way I am. I think if I was trying to find a source for it, I guess it might be in my mom and her life and her upbringing and, in the Canadian prairies, and her respectful, empathic, kind way with which she navigated life with her, heaven forbid, 7 children and a husband in a little house in Southwest Calgary, right? But it was just that combination, I think, of that upbringing, the fact that I saw this in all of my impressionable years when I was up to age about 6, but that wasn't the key thing. It was the then being taken away from it for 20 years and then getting a glimpse of it and then just yearning to get back to it sort of thing, right? I think if I'd stayed in the small town, I would have just, as you referenced earlier, I would have perhaps ignored it or glossed over it or not seen it. If I'd not been in the small town, the seed wouldn't have been planted. So it was that very fortuitous, uh, you know, set of circumstances in my life, the planting of the seed, the being taken away and then glimpsing back into it and then very powerfully connecting to it after that.
That's beautiful. And I don't know if this work of yours, it sounds like it started as mostly like the impetus was driven by your own passion, really, for what you were seeing and your own curiosity. Was there a time in your career over the last 5 decades where that passion and curiosity transferred into some kind of historical documentation or like a responsibility to Alberta, the prairies? Like, is there a moment in your career where you thought, you know what, I think the work that I'm doing is actually going to be historically important to this place when I'm gone?
Yeah, it's I think it's a good question. I think, to be honest, it's almost like a byproduct. I'm going to throw another quote out by the English art historian Kenneth Clark, and he once beautifully said, "Facts become art through love." Right. So the
Hmm.
thing that took me there was this affection, and that affection was so boundless and so deep that it connected me with these places and these people for many, many decades. And, it- I think it's completely true to say that none of this stuff was intentional. I mean, the fact that I wander around and photograph in small towns just because I kind of like them and I like the shape of the building and the quality of the light and the way that things have faded over time, or that I just absolutely adore going out and spending an afternoon with the little Hutterite girls on the colony. Those are all things that uh, they were done intuitively and not intentionally. And when I think about the Hutterites, when I first used to go out, I would photograph and I would take photographs back and they would just receive them almost like a piece of, like somebody giving you a chalice. They would treat them as these sacred objects. Now, of course, when they turn 17 or 18, the young Hutterite people all have cell phones. So,
True.
so it wasn't that I was out to record this incredible change in that social structure, but it just happened. And I think, at age nearly 75, you just sort of observe this, that the commonplace, ordinary thing, or the thing that's done with some attraction or affection, uh, time transforms it, right? And it does. You're right. I think I would say that one way that I think about the work I'm doing, as I always try to take it as simply, directly, and uncreatively as possible, so that the subject, transcribed with honesty and restraint on my part, that unleashes what makes the stuff, I think, potentially historically interesting, because I'm not working with the material, I'm serving the material.
That's a beautiful distinction. And you'd mentioned the Hutterites. I would love to move to maybe a story from that. I think the book is called A World Within. I'm pretty certain I've got this one, in that iconic photograph that you have opened up with the two kids in the shadow.
Mhm.
I mean, you've been given access as, like a white male in southern Alberta to some pretty incredible places, like the Hutterites, for example, I know there's a lot of women and children.
Mhm.
So there must be an immense responsibility that you carry to go into some of these places and photograph their lives with a lot of respect. And for the Hutterites particularly, how did you get your foot in the door to get into a community that I have regarded as being quite closed?
You're absolutely right about that, Eamon, and I do remember, I think it was in the late 1980s. Not everybody listening to this podcast might be familiar with the Hutterites, but the Hutterites are a fundamentalist Christian group similar to the Amish or the Mennonites. And the Hutterite traditions extend back about 500 years ago. They were part of the transformation of separate Christian groups separating from, the larger, the Catholic tradition. And when I would see Hutterite people in the city, or when I was a boy, I was always really fascinated with them. But I also had a built-in, I guess, respect and admiration, because they do take the tenets of sort of traditional Christianity and they kind of live it out in terms of their communal settings and the like. And so many years ago, in the 1980s, late 1980s, I would go out randomly to Hutterite colonies and I would introduce myself and ask if I might make some photographs. And I was given a little bit of access, and then I would print the photographs, I would bring them back. And then I had a little album so that when I went to colonies that I'd never been before, I could show people examples of the kind of work that I was doing. And yeah, there's something enormously appealing about the way that they live their lives, simple, traditional agricultural lives on the prairies. And then about 25 years ago, I was in this room where we are right now. And after class one night, I was talking to one of the guys in the class who was a surveyor. And he just let it slip. He said, well, I'm working on a project. We're doing some surveying for a large dam that's going to be constructed in southern Alberta. And he said, it's an interesting project, but it's going to have a sort of an unfortunate consequence. There's a Hutterite colony just downriver from the dam, and that colony is going to be destroyed. It's going to be flooded by this dam. So I got a little bit of information from him, and on Easter Sunday, 1999, I drove out to within about a mile or two of the colony, and I sat in my car in agony for about 2 or 3 hours, because I thought this is one of the most incredible things I'm ever likely to have an opportunity to photograph. But I also knew there'd be one chance. I would drive onto the colony as a stranger. I would meet somebody, and then the door would be opened a crack, it would be closed. No second chances. That's where the agony came from. So I had a nap, woke up, drove on to the colony, and the Hutterite colonies, typically people are either working in the fields or in their homes. So I drove up. There's 30 houses, and I sat there for about a half an hour. I didn't see a soul, right? Finally, somebody came out, and a guy named Paul, who I've gotten to know very well over the years, and I explained what I wanted to do. And he said, well, I can't really give you permission. This is not something that we normally permit. And just to clarify, the reason that the Hutterites don't permit photography, I mean, they're very private people. But the other thing is they associate photography, especially the more traditional Hutterite sects, as being a prideful activity. It's associated with vanity, pride,
Right.
self-promotion. So the idea of having a photograph of yourself on the wall doesn't cut it. That's exact flip of the coin to the humility, which is so essential to their culture. So I think he sensed that I was slightly disappointed. I didn't say anything, but my face probably dropped a bit. And he said, well, just wait a minute. My son, Steve, isn't too busy this afternoon. And Steve was probably in his late teens, early 20s. So Steve took me for a walk. And he walked me around the colony. It happens to be an incredibly interesting place. It was the place where one of the first farms in southern Alberta was built. It was also the place of a buffalo jump. So it's archaeologically really rich. And he showed me some old teepee rings. I thought, wow, this place is incredible. So we were off to a somewhat good start. So I thanked Steve and I thanked his dad, Paul. And then I waited a couple of weeks and I came back again and I said, is there any chance I could just maybe walk around and maybe take some pictures of the animals or the buildings or something like that, right? And they said, yeah, that's going to be okay. And then the next big day came up because I then was requested to go in and speak to so on the colonies, there's two authority figures. One is the minister and one is the colony boss. One is the business guy and one is the spiritual side. But the person who is in the role to make the decision about whether I would be permitted to come onto the colony was a guy named Ed Hofer. Ed was the colony boss. I've gotten to know Ed very well over these, but he was a very stern, large, taciturn man. So I went in, sat down at the kitchen table across from Ed, and at the end of the table was his wife, Catherine. And so I made my little pitch. I said, I'm interested in recording the story. I respect the Hutterite traditions and the history and what you do here. And he said, well, George, this is going to be really difficult for us to do because we are in negotiations with the province of Alberta right now. And our lawyers have told us that we under no circumstances could talk to the media or anything because it might jeopardize our relationship and it might, create problems in terms of this deal being properly put through. And then my heart really sank. And then Ed took a very quick, gentle glance over to his wife, who was sitting at our right. She dropped her chin in assent. And then I sat on my hands because he hadn't said anything at that point, right? And because I knew I was in because of her. And I've told her that many times. It was that her wifely, grandmotherly female intuition that got me in there, right? And then I started to go out more often and I started to spend time with the kids. And I had many wonderful memories, one which was kind of bittersweet. I went out one day and as I was driving onto the colony, one of the young men came out and said, well, George, there's going to be a funeral this afternoon because one of the elders have passed away. And he said, so things are going to be busy. You're welcome to be here, but things are going to be busy. So I was walking through the colony and the children, primarily the first language of the colony is German. And that's really all the kids speak up through and including kindergarten. And then when they get into grade 1, they start to speak English and they're very fluently bilingual by the time that they're adults. So there's a little chain link fence around the kindergarten just, for safety because it's an agricultural area. There's animals and that, but there's a little chain link fence around the kindergarten. I was walking past the kindergarten And the woman who ran the kindergarten, she saw me. She walked out the chain link fence and said, and I'll never forget this. She said, "George, I have to help in the kitchen. Would you be willing to take over the kindergarten for a couple of hours?"
Whoa. Big, big responsibility
And
and acceptance in the tribe.
and what a trusting thing, right?
Hmm.
I just, it brings tears to my eyes even now when I think back on it. So I said, yeah, of course, I'd love to do it, right? So just to put things in context, so she was out at the chain link fence. I walked in, and I walked through the door. I glanced in, and I saw about 7 children, ages 3 to 5, right? They didn't see her because she'd gone to the kitchen. They see me. I look in, and then shrieks of mayhem and out of control. 2 hours transpired. Luckily, no one was badly injured during the time, but it was...
You're like the sub, so everyone knows when the sub comes, it's party time.
It was party time kind of a thing, right? So, so those kind of things are very, very, very precious, those relationships. And I have been, at this point, it's been over 25 years that I've been going out and visiting. And, the little girl that you're referring to on the cover of the book, Maria, we've become very, very good friends. And she's now the mother of 4.
Wow.
And several years ago, I'd been out because her father suddenly and tragically passed away quite suddenly from cancer. And I saw Maria just after the funeral was over, and she was in a very advanced state of her pregnancy with her, I think, her 3rd child at that point. And she, we didn't have much time to talk. She was obviously very upset with the passing of her dad. And so we just had a short time. About 10 days later, I was at home. I usually have my phone turned off at night. I turn my phone on. There's a text message, and it says, "George, this is Maria. I wanted you to be the first to know. I had a baby boy.
Oh.
I named him after my dad, Jonathan."
Oh. So you've kind of become, in some ways, like the honorary grandfather of these children, or an honorary family member in some way.
Yeah.
You've really been taken into the fold with the Hutterites.
And, there is, and we've talked about this when I met your young daughter, there's something just so beguiling and spiritual and enchanting about young girls, right? And I look at them and they're just angelic little creatures, right? I just love them to bits. And it is one of those lovely things because as the kind of the grandfather figure, I want to keep them safe, but I'm slightly more indulgent than their own grandparents are. So for them, it's kind of the ideal combination, right, of attributes, right? So, they've been incredibly dear to me, and I just find the way that they live their lives. And, it says so much about a child, in my estimation, that a young child has such an inborn sense of trust in a way that it's people in our culture can't and shouldn't. Young children, they shouldn't have that sense of trust. But so to be in the presence of children that intuitively give that is really powerful.
I totally get you. I feel like that sometimes about my daughter. Like, she's so trusting, and I'm like, gosh, I feel sad for the day that comes when she is going to be crushed by the discovery of what the world is like. And I hope that she can keep that, perspective as long as possible. But is the Hutterite project one of your favorites, or do you have a project that you've been working on that's one of your favorites?
I think it's certainly been the longest project, just because I remember when I did the photographs over about a 4-year period. And so there was that initial meeting. And then 4 years later, on Easter Sunday, I drove out, and the colony was under almost 100 feet of water, right? I mean, it was kind of an amazing transition thing, right? And at that point, I thought, I've done everything I can here. I've been given a great gift. And then several years after that, the photographs that were taken in that 4-year period between Easter Sunday 1999 and Easter Sunday 2003. They were published in the book that you're referencing. And I thought, well, that's kind of it, right? But I couldn't stay away, right? It was just, I couldn't. It was impossible, right? They've become such dear friends. And so what happened a number of years after this book was published, it's an interesting thing. The Hutterite social structure accommodates approximately 100 people. So they have a chicken man, a dairy man, gardeners, teachers. They just have it like and so when a colony gets to be approximately 100, what they then start doing is they start looking for land. And then they have this beautiful term. They say, we want to establish a daughter colony, right? And so the daughter colony of Little Bow is a colony called Shadow Ranch. And Shadow Ranch is not far away. In recent years, what I frequently do is I'll go out to the Shadow Ranch colony, and I'll often stay overnight with my friend Matthew and his wife Helen. And Matthew and I got to be super tight when he was about 14. I'd pull up in my Ford Explorer. He'd scamper out with an audio cassette to show you the time, and he'd jam the Johnny Cash thing in and crank the volume up to full tilt, right? He was about 14. I think he's like 37 now, right? And he and his wife, Helen, often had me over, staying over, and then I can just make a short trip the next day over to Little Bow. But at this point, it's except for COVID, there now exists an archive of about 25 years of photographs of Little Bow, and an archive of about 10 years of photographs of Shadow Ranch, going back to when it was being established.
Wow, that's incredible. What an incredible, I'm sure they're just so thrilled with the book and the beauty and the way that you've portrayed them, and that kind of intimacy you've given so many of us a window into a world that I think we could only dream of entering ourselves. And I'm also thinking of your book, which I know that I have this book here, The People of the Blood. And I believe you have a photojournalism background, right?
Well, actually, I'm going to respectfully correct you.
On please
that.
Tell me.
So what I do have, I have a political science degree. I thought of at one point going into law school, and then I also have a journalism degree from Carleton University. So I studied journalism at Carleton University in Ottawa, and that's now getting to be the better part of 50 years ago, or actually a little bit longer than 50 years. But I'm just going to take a small aside here, if I may.
Of course.
One of my first jobs after university, I did have an opportunity to work as a technical writer and editor at SAIT. And as I think I shared with you in the past, one of my first projects when I was here at SAIT as a technical writer and editor was to write a series of scripts about darkroom work. Developing film, printing, and the like. And when I got the assignment, my heart just sank because I'm not technical. I didn't like photography. Things like f-stops and shutter speeds just gave me a headache, right? So I was just dreading taking this thing on, but it was assigned, so I had to do it. So I walked into two things. I spoke to, say it had a couple of staff photographers, so I talked to them and made some notes, and then I went into the library, which at that time was on the third floor of this building. We're in the basement in the darkroom, but the third floor of this building housed the SAIT library. So I went to the stacks and I went to the photography section. There was there was also a section of portfolio books by well-known photographers. So I saw this odd name on the spine of one of the books, which I thought said Henri Cartier-Bresson, which I subsequently learned is Henri Cartier-Bresson. And so I pulled the book down. This is over 50 years ago. I started looking through it, and I knew more than anything in the world I wanted to be a photographer. It was a lightning bolt, life-transforming moment for me, right? And so I went out and I got my first camera, and then I started walking around attempting to emulate this. street photography and then documentary photography that I would see with especially Diane Arbus's work. I was really, really, really moved by it. But as I've often said to students, and I think it's true, one of the great gifts you have in seeing other people's work is that if you see something and you are just absolutely crushed by it, and you think, this is the most amazing stuff I've ever seen, that's a powerful clue. That's telling you who you are. That's telling you who your potential gifts might be, right? So, I to go back to your initial question, I do have a journalism background in terms of, writing, interviewing, story structuring, and that sort of thing. But the photography was just this chance book spine in the State Library 50 years ago, and then just being unleashed. And then when I saw Diane Arbus's book for people, briefly, Cartier-Bresson is most revered for his incredible street photography done all over the world. Arbus for the incredible intimacy and access that she got to the people that she photographed. So Cartier-Bresson gave me the inspiration, and Arbus gave me the permission to start doing the stuff I do.
That's beautiful. And the reason I brought it up is because it's one of the books, at least that stands out in my mind, where there's like a diary portion. You've obviously visited several times and noted things that you've observed and different meetings and such. And so I wanted to know, like, with this journalism background, as you've mentioned, interviewing and collecting notes and such, is that part of your practice with everything that you shoot?
It is. And I think I've really been inspired by, there's a number of American writers. Everybody will have heard of Truman Capote. Many of your listeners may have heard of Gay Talese, the great New York writer of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Others of Joan Didion, the great journalist who was based in California. And the thing that I was so deeply moved by when I read, Capote or Didion or Talese was the intimacy and the access, right? I mean, how do you walk up to somebody that you don't know and have them kind of open up to you, right? And I don't know if I still don't know the answer to that, but it was a fascinating thing to sort of, consider. And also it brings up the central ethical dilemma in the work that they did and the work that I do. People like Capote, for instance, getting into a lot of detail, a case can be made that he really kind of exploited a relationship. Joan Didion once painfully famously said, quote, "We're in the business of selling people out."
Oof.
Oof, exactly, right? And on some level, that's admirable, because people like Didion and Capote say, the truth is the highest value, right? Now, there's another school of thought that says kindness is the highest value, but you can't have both. And if truth is the highest value, you can become brutal and cutthroat. If kindness is the highest value, you can become sentimental, right? So both of those ways of approaching storytelling have danger zones in them, right?
Sure.
So you have to negotiate your place. Now, I'm clearly not in the truth. It's not that I'm dishonest, but kindness, withholding, discretion. There's a lot of stuff that I know about people and situations that's completely true. Didion and Capote would have shared that information. I will often choose to withhold it. It's not that I'm being dishonest, but I'm withholding something, right? And it's an interesting dilemma. It's not a dilemma. For me, it's crystal clear. I don't even think about it in the way that they didn't think about it either. But they're both legitimate ways to work, and they both have seeds of destruction or damage or problems in them. So there's not. So what most people do, that work as, especially in, I'm going to say documentary, they're always negotiating where that place is, essentially, right? If I let my kind of, for want of a better word, empathy or kindness overwhelm, then I turn all these people into Disney characters.
True. Yeah, it's interesting. I can see the comparison with, for example, something like memoir, where it's maybe not even an absolute truth, but it's also like depending on the perspective, right? Like, let's say, for example, a family with two children would have two different truths about their family. So in a sense, it's like you're lending your lens to look at certain truths through, and whatever you're delivering to us is also imbued with so much of your own experience and your kindness and what you're withholding, which is also a kindness to your subjects.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, like, I feel like a photographer is almost like not enough to encapsulate the work that you do. Like, do you see yourself as an artist, as a historian, a witness, an archivist? How do you describe the work that you do?
I mean, I think it is all of those things that you've talked about. It's, I think, maybe my most accurate description, I see myself either as a delivery boy or a pipeline, right? There's something divine, there's something in the world, and maybe I'm the pipeline, or maybe
You're like the medium.
maybe I'm the delivery boy kind of thing,
The
right?
medium, the channel.
And I think that's, for me, that feels like a wonderful thing. And again, I'm going to, reference my mom. She was a great wife. She was a great mother. And I think, sometimes she, especially where women are considered, the idea of service in some mindsets, and I understand this, is seen as something, to be pushed back against, or it's somehow diminishing, the idea of, respect for a woman's serving her child or her husband or something like that. But there's also something incredibly powerful. The sort of the basic Christian tradition is that, and at the highest levels, I think this is true. Like, what's the Pope supposed to do? He's supposed to serve the flock, right? He's not supposed to lead. He's supposed to serve. I think that idea of, Christianity and Jesus, for instance, as serving as opposed to leading, I think is a powerful thing. And so I think that I love the idea of being the server, the delivery, and I say it as, and hopefully maybe it's the best and most authentic me. And it's not that I'm that, as you know, this is what I aspire to. I day-to-day life, I'm not this saintly creature that I'm portraying here, as you clearly know. But the idea of serving the story, is really, really appealing to me. And you'll see it here. But I've been extensively photographing, which nobody knows about, but I'm going to tell you because it's you, Yamuna.
Oh.
Photographing the development of the suburbs around Calgary for 20 years.
Oh.
Housing being built, how land is transformed, how these vertical structures enter into the horizontal landscape, how the light strikes them, how, an empty field ultimately becomes somebody's home. That's cool. And someday those pictures will be seen, maybe at some point, probably, because they'll be in the Glen Bullet somewhere in a box. It's serving that maybe overlooked story, perhaps.
I'm coming up with the word conduit also, like,
yeah,
you're like a conduit of some kind of spirit that, like is propelling you to document and capture these stories and the changing landscapes of Alberta, which I can only imagine the changes that you've seen in 5 decades through your camera here. Mm-hmm. Is there a favorite place that you've visited and photographed in all this career of yours?
That's a good question. I have just enormous affection for the Drumheller Badlands, and there is one of the books that we have on the desk here is a book called Badlands, and of course it was so incredible to see as a kid, because you can imagine a 6-year-old boy with his pocket full of plastic dinosaurs going out into the Badlands with his grandfather Frank, and at that time it was completely legal to to harvest bones. Now the provincial law discourages people from doing that because of the potential damaging of scientifically valuable information. But I remember myself out there 9 years old, after we'd moved to Calgary, but I was out with my grandfather, and I see this big bone, sticking out of the side of the hill, right? And I wanted that bone bad, right? And my grandfather looked at it and where it was and and he said, "Georgie, I'm sorry, it's just not going to be possible to get that out of here, right?" So I teared up, right? I didn't do it intentionally, but half an hour later, there was my grandfather Frank staggering down the hill, carrying this 100-pound bone out of the Badlands kind of thing, right?
Whoa.
And there's just something about that act of discovery, finding, digging, looking back at and imagining stories that is very, very powerful. And so, I haven't really photographed in the Badlands for many years, but every year I go out and spend some time in Drumheller because the place and the memories and the sort of the magical spiritual quality of the place is really exceptional. And it's something that it's left a mark, obviously, growing up in a place like that.
Yeah, the mysticism of the Badlands is palpable. That is for sure. It's an incredibly unique place that I also really love and haven't been to this summer. So thank you for planting that seed. I feel like your work is legacy work, like 100%. Your photographs are incredibly beautiful by themselves,
Mhm.
but you, in my opinion, and probably many opinions, are also creating a massive archival legacy for future generations of Albertans and other folks. What does that mean to you to leave this kind of legacy, and what do you hope that the future generations will learn about this place through viewing your work?
I don't like to think about that much, right? Because I think in some ways, I think I don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, right? I think there's something, it's interesting. Like, I think creative work does call for a certain amount of mindfulness and thinking about, what you're doing and the implications. But I think that has to be dealt with pretty carefully, especially as you get older, like me, right? You start to think in terms of, I've done something and so what am I doing now and how is it going to be seen and how does it fit in with things that I've done in the past? And so I largely kind of keep that stuff at bay. Now, I will though say that there's a couple of things that I'm very, very proud of and pleased about. These books, they have a life. And, I'm very fortunate and very, very, very blessed to have a significant amount of my work in major public collections. I was up several weeks ago up to Edmonton with my one of my brothers, my brother Jim, at the Art Gallery of Alberta. And there's an exhibition there that includes, people like Andy Warhol, right? And it's all work drawn from the AGA's permanent collection. And one of the first projects that I did, I used to go down and photograph. There was a thing in Calgary called Stampede Wrestling. The Hart family were involved in it, right? In the late 1970s, photographing this wrestling culture, and it was it was kind of my first inspired project from the work I'd seen of Diane Arbus. And it's a really interesting, primitive, out of a different time kind of a feel when you look at that work, right? And so having work in there, the National Archives of Canada also has an extensive collection of work of, work from the Blood Reserve, work from, the Saskatchewan, the small towns. But my great patron saint, of course, is the Glenbow Museum, and they have a very, very extensive holdings. And I do think that much of what I've done, I hope, and I think it will be the case that, with the passage of time, the work just automatically becomes more interesting. I think it's like if I was to say, I'm going to go and take a picture of my brother standing in front next to his car in front of his house, people would kind of yawn. But if I said to you, I could, you can look at a picture of your grandmother or grandfather standing next to his car in front of his house. It becomes something absolutely fascinating because there's all the stuff, there's the implications, there's the history, the stuff that's kind of embedded in just this fact-based work. And so, like, if the work that I do didn't find its way into a book or into a collection, it's perhaps it's best bringing to an audience, which I believe is going to be many, many years from now, wouldn't be there. So I think that what I do, time needs to work on it, kind of thing, and then I think people see it with fresh eyes, and then it potentially has its greatest value, perhaps.
That's beautiful. And I think one of the most incredible things is that you are actually accessible in the darkroom of SAIT. And for people listening who are interested in darkroom work, I think you've created this beautiful space that there's this like renaissance and revival of darkroom photography here. And it's incredible to be able to come to participate in your class and learn from you and just get to know you as a person. And I am urging anyone out there who is interested in darkroom work in Calgary to come and take your class. It's been such an honor to speak with you and to know you, George. I'm so glad that I've been a student of yours and that I've had a lifetime of memories with you. Thank you so much for being a part of this show. And here's to many more books and projects in your name. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Yumuna.
You've been listening to The Long Road Home, a podcast for travelers, storytellers, and culture makers, exploring the roots that shape us and the roads that lead us home. I'm Yumuna. See you on the road.